My name is Michael Waddington and I'm a criminal defense attorney. In this video, I want to answer a question that pretty much anyone who does criminal defense is asked all the time. How do you represent guilty people? Or sometimes I get asked, do you represent guilty people? If you ask that question, which a lot of people do, then you probably should go back and take a civics lesson, at the third grade level and study a little bit about the Constitution, why we have certain rights in the Constitution, before you are on asking lawyers whether or not they represent guilty people. Of course I represent guilty people. Of course I represent people that may be falsely accused. I also represent people that are 100% guilty. How do I do that? Why do I do that? Well, the bottom line is I don't really care if they're guilty or if they're innocent. That is not my position when we take on a case. It goes something like this. We get a phone call into our law firm and someone explains to us a legal problem that they're having. I don't know whether they committed the crime, didn't commit the crime. I don't know if the government is targeting them and they're completely innocent. I don't know if the government's going to actually charge them with what they committed. Because a lot of times people get charged with crimes that they didn't commit, or the government swings for the fences and they try to get and accuse someone of a charge that they really can't prove with the hopes of getting a plea deal. For example, you can be 100% law-abiding citizen, no criminal background, nothing on your record. Let's say you're driving home from work and you look down at your phone to see who's calling you and you accidentally hit someone with your car. You weren't being negligent, or were you, by looking down for that 1 second? After all, why would the person run out in front of your car? But either way, we have a dead body. So let's just take it a step further. We now have a person who is a respectable member of the community that was the one that was hit by the car. Maybe they're riding their bike, maybe they're running into the traffic. Like a lot of people like to run on the street. And around here in Florida, a lot of people get hit by cars, unfortunately. But the bottom line is, the person that's driving the car may or may not have committed a crime. So let's take that example, and that's you or your mother or father or son or daughter. And you get a phone call saying, hey, listen, I was in an accident. There's someone who died. We need a lawyer. So when you call us, we're not going to start grilling you, the mother, the father, the person who's being accused as to whether you're guilty or not guilty. That's not what we're doing. Our job is to make sure that you have effective counsel, to make sure that your rights are protected, that someone advises you and stands up for your rights under the Constitution, and to make sure that you don't get railroaded into jail for something maybe you didn't do, or to make sure that you didn't get an excessive punishment because maybe the prosecutor is overzealous, maybe the investigator investigated you aggressively and had you charged with things maybe you didn't do. Maybe they got witnesses to lie. Who knows? That's why you need a lawyer, and that's why we get involved in cases. So as we go along in the case, we start getting discovery. That's usually months and months down the road. You're already our client. We've already been advising you and representing you in many situations for months and months and sometimes years before we actually get the evidence. When we get the evidence for the first time, we look through the evidence. Now, that being said, a lot of times the evidence is one-sided because depending on who's investigating, they might have done a very biased, one-sided investigation. So we might only get some of the evidence, some of the statements, some of the witnesses are interviewed. And in that situation, what do? Do you say, oh my God, it sounds like my client's guilty, I have to quit this case? Well, first of all, you can't quit the case. You already represent the person. They brought you in as their lawyer. You now ethically have an obligation to represent and advise and defend them unless they fire you. So at that situation, you may be saying, well, how can you represent someone that seems to be guilty? First of all, once you're in as a lawyer, it's like a doctor that's operating someone on the operating table that was shot in a gunshot wound. Halfway through the surgery, the doctor is not interrogating the person to be like, are you in a gang? Did you start the fight? Did you deserve it? Are you a bad person? And then halfway through it, then they say, well, you know what? I think this guy probably deserved it. He was in a gang-related shooting or a drug-related shooting. I'm going to kill him on the table and let him to die. We have the same obligation as lawyers. Once you get involved in the case, you have a duty to represent that client to make sure that their rights are protected. Now, At that point in time, even if your client is guilty, you can advise them, and you have to advise them of what their options are and what their rights are under the law. Should you plead guilty? Should you plead not guilty? But either way, the client drives the train. So if the client says, I don't want to take the plea deal that's offered by the government, or the lawyer says that's not really a fair plea deal, then you have to take the lead from the client and do what the client wants you to do. Let's say the client's 100% guilty, and they say, I want to fight this. I don't believe that they can prove their case. I want to fight this. They have the right to a trial, whether it's by judge or by jury, and you have to defend them at the trial and make sure under the law and ethically that the government proves their case, which means you have to cross-examine people, present evidence that's exculpatory or shows the person maybe didn't do it, show evidence in mitigation, raise any defenses that are there legally. Now, you can't make up stuff, you can't make up lies, but you have an ethical obligation to zealously defend that client, whether or not you may or may not think they're guilty. Let's go back to the scenario where you're driving a car, your mom or dad are driving a car, and you hit someone with the car. Let's say that they look down at their phone a little bit too long, in your opinion as the lawyer, as the defense lawyer. What do? And this goes into the question, well, how do you represent someone that's guilty? What if they did look down at their phone for an extra 6 seconds? You still have an obligation to advise them and represent them and zealously advocate for them. And why is that the case? Imagine every time the police accuse someone and charge them with a crime. Now, cops are not lawyers. Investigators are generally biased against people they think committed crimes, even if they think they're doing the right thing. So they'll often add a lot more charges than they should. So it's the lawyer's job to then look at the charges and to determine what they should be charged with, if anything. And at this point in time, if you're the defense lawyer, you have to investigate and advise your client to try to get them the best outcome possible. Because if you didn't, even if the person's guilty, the police could put whatever they want on the charges, and then the prosecution could just charge anyone they want with any charges, and then no one would stand up to counteract the charges. Even if the charges are false, no one would stand up for that person. No one would defend that person. So instead of being charged with maybe with nothing, or with some sort of vehicular manslaughter or assault or something, or negligent driving or something like that, the prosecutor could charge you with murder, and you would have no one to defend you. So I always tell people when they ask that question, which I get all the time. Someone asked me that yesterday in response to a YouTube video accusing me of being a terrible person because I represent guilty people. What if someone accused you? And you think it's all fun and games until someone does accuse you, until you do go out to the bar and you have a drink or two and you get pulled over, and maybe you're not drunk at all, but you get charged with the DUI, and no one wants to stand up for you and no one wants to advise you. And now you could always say, well, you shouldn't be driving and drinking at all, but it's not illegal to drive unless you're intoxicated. It's advisable to take an Uber, by the way, to avoid that situation. But there's all sorts of fact patterns that can happen. Let's say you're an adult and you file on your tax return, you put down some donations that you made to the local church, and you write down $500 donation worth of clothes and things like that. Are those clothes really worth that amount? And let's say someone were to charge you with fraud, tax evasion, some sort of deceit and deception to the government over that tax return that you filed. And we're going to dig into that and find out whether or not it was $500 or $400. Because if it was $400, you may have committed a crime. You may be going to jail for 5 years. You may lose your job. Those are all things that can happen to a person who's 100% law-abiding, who's not a career criminal. And when it happens to you, then you go immediately looking for the best lawyer possible. I can't tell you how many people we represented over the past 20 years at our law firm that are law enforcement, that are military members, military officers with no criminal background. I'm talking like Green Berets, Navy SEALs, people that are doctors and dentists in the military. These are upstanding, law-abiding citizens, all-American citizens with no record. In those cases, it's the same thing. We take on the case, we agree to zealously defend the constitutional rights of those people that are accused, and we make sure the government does their job and our client has the best legal representation possible, and we try to get them the best outcome possible. So you shouldn't be casting stones about people that are accused, because one day it could be you, and guess who you're going to want on your side when you are accused of a crime, maybe that you did, maybe that you didn't do, or maybe there's some ambiguity, you're going to want the best lawyer possible. So going back to what I said in the beginning, if you ask that dumb question of how do you represent people that could be guilty, you need to read the Constitution that protects your rights as well as the rights of every person in this country.